This program is made possible by grants from Humanities Kansas and the Sunflower Foundation in partnership with the Geary County Historical Society.
This is Pandemic on the Prairie, a podcast about the 1918 influenza pandemic in Kansas and what local stories tell us about the American experience more broadly. I'm your host, Kara Heitz. Join me as we learn about this important moment in history and perhaps through the past, come to better understand the present. Hey everyone, this is Kara. So when COVID first hit, I remember reading a flurry of articles about the 1918 influenza pandemic, comparing it to our current experience and trying to draw lessons from the past. And I noticed that in a lot of these newspaper and magazine accounts, there were a few really similar lines referencing the same story, that the influenza pandemic of over a century ago probably started in Kansas. Hey, that's where I live.
The exact source of the Spanish flu is unclear, but some have come to believe that it should have been called the Kansas flu.
One theory designates the flu's origin at Camp Funston near Junction City, a military installation known these days as Fort Riley.
In March 1918, with the United States fully mobilized for World War I, soldiers at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, Kansas, began reporting acute flu-like symptoms, including aches, respiratory distress, chills, coughing, and high fever. Just a month later, over 1,100 men had come down with the disease. 46 of them, roughly 4%, had died.
So how is it that something often called the Spanish flu may have started in Kansas? Where in the world did this theory come from? To get to the bottom of this, we're going to follow a paper trail, and one with some pretty major gaps. Unfortunately, this is kind of standard in a lot of historical research. But it will lead us to a conversation with historian John Barry, who wrote what is considered the definitive book on the influenza pandemic, and one that cites Kansas as the pandemic's source.
There were pockets where you could see that this thing had the potential to be very, very old.
But these days, even he might not be sure about the Kansas origins. Finally, we'll ask, why does it matter to know where the pandemic started? I mean, if the pandemic of 1918 was called the Kansas flu, would that have changed the way the world thinks about Kansas? Would it have changed the way Kansans think of themselves? So before we detangle the paper trail, here's a little background on the Kansas origin story. So the deadly fall 1918 wave of the influenza pandemic was actually the second wave of the disease. The first wave appeared during the spring of 1918, and it's this first wave that may have originated in Kansas, specifically at Camp Funston. Camp Funston was part of Fort Riley at the time. Army recruits from all over the country came to Camp Funston to train before being shipped off to fight in Europe. Remember, World War I is going on at this time. So in early March, a cook at Camp Funston gets sick, and pretty soon lots of soldiers start coming into the infirmary with the same symptoms: high fever, sore throat, body aches, lethargy. These were the classic symptoms of influenza, or the grippe as it was sometimes called in those days. That's actually the fancy French name. But by the end of March, there were over 1,100 confirmed cases, with probably even more cases unconfirmed. So this first wave of the flu was certainly not fun to get. It would knock you off your feet for a few days. But people didn't die in high numbers from it, unlike the later waves. It was just a bad flu. So, as this story goes, the first wave of the flu spreads from Camp Funston across military bases and camps in the U.S. Remember, with the war, military personnel are on the move. It was then brought first to France by U.S. troops in April of 1918, and from there it spread across the battlefields and then towns of Europe as the war raged on. So the first wave makes its way around Europe and even to other places on the globe, but then it kind of disappears by mid to late summer of 1918. It goes dormant. This is the real mysterious part in the story of the flu pandemic. The current speculation is that sometime over the summer, it mutates into a different strain of the flu, the deadly pandemic strain. This strain shows up pretty much simultaneously in 3 places around the world in August of 1918: Freetown, Sierra Leone, Brest, France, and Boston, Massachusetts. And from there, it spreads worldwide, including across the entire United States, where it eventually kills over 50 million people globally, around 675,000 in the U.S., and even 12,000 people in Kansas. So, pretty compelling story, right? Case closed. But not so fast, because as a historian, I wondered whether this Kansas origin story was true and what was the actual evidence in favor of it. I know how one version of a story can get picked up and repeated until it just becomes accepted as truth. So where did this story come from? How did the story spread? And more importantly, how did the flu get to Camp Funston in the first place? So to help answer these questions, I invite you to follow me along the paper trail. Our first stop will help dispense with the common misunderstanding about the origins of the flu pandemic. It's an item from the Junction City Union on May 28, 1918.
Strange disease in Spain. Business life in Madrid is almost paralyzed by the outbreak of a species of grip, the exact nature of which has not been determined, although it is not fatal. Theaters and moving picture houses are deserted, while the tramways are crippled. 30% of the population is affected. King Alfonso is indisposed and is believed to be suffering from the disease.
I have to admit, I actually laughed a little bit when I came across this article during my research, as Junction City is located right next to Fort Riley and therefore Camp Funston. So we call the influenza pandemic the Spanish flu because Spain was hit particularly hard by the first wave, but even more importantly because the press in Spain reported being hit hard by the flu. Spain was neutral in World War I and did not have press censorship in place. Countries fighting on both sides of the war, including the U.S., did have some level of wartime censorship of the press and tried to limit reporting on items such as a widespread disease outbreak that could reduce morale and support for the war effort. And of course, it got to Spain, according to the story we're following, because American troops brought the flu to Europe from Camp Funston. So the earliest reference to a spring influenza outbreak at Camp Funston, a reference cited by many of the contemporary books and articles on the 1918 pandemic, is an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association, January 11, 1919, called Pneumonia at Camp Funston by doctors Opie, Freeman, Blake, Small, and Rivers. That's quite a mouthful. Kind of sounds like a law office or, maybe even a folk music group. So here is what that article had to say about the March outbreak.
Outbreak of pneumonia occurring in association with influenza. It is desirable to describe the disease which has been diagnosed as influenza, which within a few days swept as a great epidemic through Camp Funston. The disease was accompanied by fever with the elevation of temperature from 99 to 102 or 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The patient was prostrate, had a severe headache, and complained of aching pains in the muscles. After 24 to 48 hours, the temperature fell and the patient felt better. Between March 4 and March 29, 1,127 men from Camp Funston, which then contained 29,000 men, were sent to the base hospital with the disease just described, and many more were cared for in the infirmaries of the camp.
Okay, so on face value, this seems like a pretty straightforward piece of evidence. Camp Funston had a flu outbreak in March of 1918. Around 1,100 soldiers at the base hospital, and many more got really sick. So this seems to fit the story of the Camp Funston origin of the first wave quite nicely. But there are a couple of weird things here. So the first thing I noticed is that the article is not actually about influenza. It's about pneumonia. The article is called Pneumonia at Camp Funston. The author's main purpose is to trace the multiple pneumonia outbreaks at Camp Funston in 1917 and 1918, including outbreaks that were connected to measles, to bronchitis, not just to influenza. So pneumonia and other diseases often go hand in hand. A bad case of the flu can make you susceptible to pneumonia. In fact, many people who died during the influenza pandemic actually had pneumonia as their official cause of death. And the study is part of a larger medical research agenda going on at the time. The U.S. military in general was very interested in the spread of communicable diseases in its camps. Why is that? Think about it. Army camps and barracks at this time are a perfect breeding ground for the spread of disease, just like nursing homes, college dorms, and even prisons today during the COVID pandemic. Institutional living arrangements create disease hotspots. So when the U.S. enters World War I, officially April 6, 1917, the U.S. had a standing army of only 127,500 soldiers. That is not that big. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army was 4 million soldiers strong, with another 800,000 in other branches of the military. So in order to mobilize and train this massive number of people, the U.S. military starts to build places like Camp Funston and the 15 other training camps across the country to make soldiers out of these regular guys. So Funston was actually the largest of these training camps, with anywhere between 20,000 to 50,000 troops living and working together. That is a lot of people crammed into one place. But on paper, it actually sounds pretty cushy, especially coming from 1918. A publication by the Department of Camp Activities and Amusements called Cantonment Life Illustrated painted a pretty rosy picture of life at Camp Funston.
Camp Funston is the only cantonment possessing a zone of camp activities. 4 city blocks long, containing an arcade, restaurants, large stores, theaters, pool halls, picture shows, barbershops, clothing repair shops, and bowling alleys. Camp Funston has 14 YMCA buildings, a large library, and numerous places of amusement and recreation. At no time in the world's history has the soldier been so well cared for as he is today.
Can I move there? I mean, after spending most of the past half a year sheltering in place at my own house, that actually sounds pretty good to me right now. Of course, the real experience of Camp Funston was probably not as great as it sounds. The Army itself admitted as much in a report that stated during the winter of 1917-1918 that barracks and tents were overcrowded and inadequately heated at Camp Funston. Because when you put tens of thousands of people into one space, even a large space, and have them living communally where they are sleeping, eating, bathing, working, and even relaxing in close proximity to thousands of other people, it's really easy for diseases to spread rapidly. And engaging in social distancing is really, really hard in these kinds of spaces. And Camp Funston is not unusual in this regard. Like all the other military bases and camps, they experienced a number of outbreaks of communicable diseases. Measles, mumps, tuberculosis, meningitis, pneumonia, all of these were of concern. Lots of people and even whole companies had been put under quarantine at Camp Funston during the war. But one disease that was not of concern, that is, of course, until later on, influenza. So the other thing that was weird to me about the Pneumonia at Camp Funston article by Dr. Opie and his pals, the one with the first mention of the Camp Funston outbreak, is its publication date, January of 1919. So why is that notable? The deadly wave of the influenza pandemic started in the U.S. just months before, in October of 1918, and it's still going on in January of 1919. In many places, it had calmed down somewhat in late 1918, only to flare up again in early 1919, typically after people had gotten lax with social distancing. That doesn't sound familiar. But these researchers, these doctors, these medical experts in this article did not make any kind of connection between the influenza outbreak they were writing about, what happened at Camp Funston just 10 months previously, to the deadly influenza pandemic they are currently in the middle of. I mean, what is up with that? So, that's because the first wave, the spring 1918 outbreak, the one that possibly started at Camp Funston in Kansas, only becomes notable, only becomes connected epidemiologically to the deadlier waves much later on. People living through the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920 really had no idea there even was a first wave, let alone where the disease originated from. So when does this connection get made? When do you get historians, epidemiologists, medical researchers connecting the dots? So when does Spain get let off the hook? So the earliest record I can find of this connection being made is in 1929 by Dr. Edwin Jordan in a book called Epidemic Influenza. Dr. Jordan was researching the flu pandemic for the American Medical Association, and this book is his published findings. It's really quite an interesting read. No, seriously. I mean, kind of long. I admit I skimmed a lot of it, but interesting because almost all the parts of the story and even controversies about the flu pandemic that still persist today are basically there in 1929. He makes the first connection between the spring flu outbreaks in the U.S. at military installations and the spring-summer spread of the first wave in Europe. He identifies Camp Funston as the first U.S. military outbreak and says this could be a, quote, plausible starting place. But he's very clear to say that this in no way is a certainty.
The 1918 pandemic of influenza resembles all previous pandemics of this disease in that its origin is largely shrouded in obscurity. Every pandemic presumably begins by radiation from a single focus or perhaps several foci, but the certain identification of early epidemic influenza presents many difficulties yet unsolved. It will probably never be possible to fix one definite starting point for the 1918 pandemic, if indeed a single starting point existed.
But darn it, Dr. Jordan, we want black and white answers. Although I do love the phrase, shrouded in obscurity. It makes it all sound very mysterious. So what I really do like the most about Jordan's book is this uncertainty. The fact that we can make an educated guess, but we probably will never know the origin of the pandemic. To me, this is also what makes Jordan a good scientist. He really owns this uncertainty. But that uncertainty often gets lost in some later articles and books on the influenza pandemic. So the next big piece of historical research that tries to connect the dots is in 1961 with A. Holling's book, The Great Epidemic, When the Spanish Influenza Struck. Adolf August Holling was a writer and newspaper reporter who also served in the Navy during World War II. And he wrote over 30 popular nonfiction books, mostly about military history. And that is great. I love getting people interested in history. But the guy was not that great at attributing his sources. And this makes trying to track them down really frustrating. The entire first chapter of Holling's book is about the Camp Funston origin, where he tells a very detailed story of the March 1918 outbreak. And this is where we get some of the familiar details recounted by many of the current magazine and newspaper articles on the flu pandemic.
On Monday morning, March 11th, before breakfast time, the duty sergeant at Hospital 91 had a caller. Albert Gitchell, a company cook, complained of a bad cold. He was feverish, suffering from a sore throat, headache, and muscular pains. Gitchell was quickly banished to a contagious ward. Hardly had a corpsman put a thermometer in the soldier's mouth when Corporal Lee W. Drake from the 1st Battalion reported to the same admitting desk. His symptoms, even to 103-degree fever, were identical with Gitchell's. Two cases with a rubber stamp similarity could have been a coincidence. However, when Sergeant Adolph Herbie came coughing moments later, the duty corpsman called for the chief nurse. By the time Lieutenant Harding had arrived at Building 91, 2 other sick soldiers were awaiting admission. Miss Harding knew she was confronted with a potentially grave situation. She cranked the wall phone. "Colonel," she commenced with concern. Sergeant Schreiner, a sober, meticulous officer, did not wait to shave, comb his mustache, or even snap the hooks and eyes of his uniform choker collar. He hurried out of his quarters and shook the nodding driver of his motorcycle and sidecar, which was always standing by. Soon he was examining his first patient, shortly his second, his third, and so on. By breakfast time, the telltale medical manifestations were as obvious to Colonel Schreiner as the inscriptions in a family Bible. There was little doubt in Dr. Schreiner's mind that the Army post had been hit with influenza.
So my first thought when reading this was, wow, what a detailed story. It really sounds like Holling talked to some of the people he mentioned by name, or at least had access to their first-hand accounts through diaries, letters, talking to family members and the like. This is really the gold standard in doing history. He mentions Surgeon Schreiner, Chief Nurse Elizabeth Harding, a side note whom elsewhere he refers to as Pretty Lieutenant Harding. Oh, mid-century casual sexism, how we don't miss you. Also Corporal Drake, Sergeant Herbie, and of course the infamous cook Albert Gitchell, the possible typhoid Mary of the influenza pandemic. But if you check the book's sources, there is really no indication of how he got these details. He does thank a bunch of people, including Lieutenant Colonel Elizabeth Harding, retired. So maybe he interviewed the chief nurse? He also lists dozens of research libraries and newspapers that were, quote, especially helpful, but it's really unclear what he actually got from these sources. Where did he get this detailed account of the outbreak at Camp Funston? You know, this is unfortunately an all too common problem when trying to fact-check historical accounts. And this is really the first published account I can find of the Albert Gitchell getting sick on March 11th story, and I can't follow the paper trail back any farther. It's really frustrating, as the story of the cook at Camp Funston being patient zero is told and retold over and over to this day. Alas, A.A. Holing is not alive anymore to ask him. So whether Albert Gitchell was the first patient and other details of Holing's account will have to remain shrouded in obscurity. There are other historical accounts written after Holing from the 1970s through the 1990s about the flu pandemic that retell the Camp Funston story and often point a finger at the cook as the first flu victim, and they all pretty much draw on the sources we've mentioned already. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, where there are some excellent and well-researched books on the flu pandemic, many of which acknowledge, like Dr. Jordan, that Camp Funston in Kansas could be a possible origin of the first wave. And this brings us to historian John Barry and his New York Times best-selling 2004 book, The Great Influenza, the epic story of the greatest plague in history. It traces a possible origin of the March 1918 influenza epidemic at Camp Funston to an even earlier flu outbreak elsewhere in Kansas. It's John Barry's research that has popularized the Kansas origin story in contemporary times and provided stronger evidence for this scenario. And you get to hear the story from John Barry himself. A side note, I'm going to history fangirl geek out a bit here. I really did not expect John Barry to agree to talk to me. Since the outbreak of COVID, he's been interviewed by all the major news outlets, CNN, NPR, CBS, Washington Post, just to name a few. And now he can add Pandemic on the Prairie to his impressive list of media appearances. So, Professor Barry, can you tell the Kansas origin story and what you discovered through your own research? What happened in early 1918 in Haskell County, Kansas, and how is that connected to Camp Funston?
Well, when I was doing the research for the book, I was scanning a publication the U.S. Public Health Service put out back then. It was a weekly report, essentially the same thing what they now call morbidity and mortality weekly report. And I was, of course, looking for first reports on the 1918 pandemic. And in April, there was something from Haskell County, Kansas. Now, in April, the disease had already appeared, actually in early March, it appeared in military camps in the United States. And by April, it was also appearing in Europe. But this, nonetheless, was the first report anywhere in the world of a lethal influenza outbreak. So I went back to the Haskell County weekly papers, and lo and behold, the actual outbreak occurred in January. And it was the first noted anywhere in the world. Influenza was not a reportable disease, and yet this outbreak was so unusual that the local doctor, Loring Minor, who was very serious about medicine and very serious about science, he actually reported it to the U.S. Public Health Service. And you could trace by name people whose families had influenza or pneumonia, which of course was what killed, and who traveled either to visit somebody or because they were drafted or had signed up. Camp Funston, several hundred miles away, part of Fort Riley. You could trace these people moving from Haskell County to Camp Funston, and 48 hours, 72 hours after they arrived, which is exactly the incubation period for influenza, you have the first reports of influenza at Camp Funston, which was prior to Haskell, the first place anywhere in the world that influenza was noticed in the spring of 1918. And therefore, it made enormous sense that the people from Haskell had actually brought influenza to Camp Funston, and that still makes great sense. And it seemed to me that it's quite possible and plausible that the virus jumped species in Haskell County and became transmissible in humans, of course, and the end result is as many as 100 million deaths worldwide.
So, as you're obviously aware, we've known about the March 1918 outbreak at Camp Funston being a possible first wave of the influenza pandemic for some time. But the question has always been, how did it get to Camp Funston? And the Haskell County, Kansas origin is obviously an answer to that question that you've uncovered. So, can you speak more about the evidence you found to help you make this connection? You just mentioned that through the local newspaper, the Santa Fe Monitor, you traced the names of people in Haskell County who came down with this flu in early 1918 and their connection to Camp Funston. So, can you elaborate a bit on this?
Well, let me just open my book to a section. I'll just read some quotes from the Santa Fe Monitor. Mrs. Evie Van Alstein is sick with pneumonia. Her little son Roy is now able to get up, which obviously implies he had been sick. Ralph Lindemann is still quite sick. Goldie Wogelhagen is working at the Beeman store during her sister Eva's sickness. Homer Moody has been reported quite sick. Merton, the young son of Ernest Elliott, is sick with pneumonia. We're pleased to report that Pete Hesser's children are recovering. Mrs. J.S. Cox is some better, but is very weak yet. Ralph McConnell's been quite sick this week. Another issue of the local newspaper. The same week that Homer Moody and a dozen others in Jean, Kansas fell ill, a young soldier named Dean Nilsson came home on leave from Funston. Ernest Elliott left Subletton to visit his brother at Funston just as his child fell ill. From nearby Copeland, Kansas, the paper said, quote, most everybody over the country is having the grippe or pneumonia, unquote. On February 28th, the paper reported that John Bottom just left Copeland for Funston, quote, we predict John will make an ideal soldier, unquote. Just a few days after these people arrived back in Funston, the disease exploded.
And from there, as we know, U.S. soldiers carry it to Europe in the late spring, and the first wave of the disease spreads across Europe, affecting troops in the war and even civilian populations, most famously in Spain, of course. But this first wave is not at all deadly like the fall 1918 second wave. So can you speak some about what this spring 1918 first wave of the flu was like and its connection to the second wave?
As a general rule, the first wave was pretty mild. For example, in the British Grand Fleet, which patrolled the coast of Europe, more than 10,000 sailors were sick enough during a war to report to sick call and miss duty. But only 4 out of over 10,000 died. That's pretty mild. More people died in Haskell. And yet there were pockets during the spring, little outbreaks, sort of like you watch a pot coming to a boil and you see those first bubbles come up from the bottom. There were pockets where you could see that this thing had the potential to be very virulent. Haskell was not only the first place in the world it was noticed, but the first place that such a bubble surfaced. But the virus apparently mutated and became much, much more virulent, so that all over the world, the experience was similar to what was happening in Haskell.
So, obviously, as you know, there are other competing theories with the Kansas origin story for the influenza pandemic. And I'm wondering what you make of these alternative origin stories. And do you still have confidence in the Kansas origin, over 15 years after you wrote your book?
There's been a lot of work that on 1918 since my book came out, which was originally in 2004. We're now speaking in 2020. And to be honest, my own views on this have changed somewhat. I think it is now more likely that the virus jumped species in China, probably in 1917. Although if that's the case, it still leaves unexplained how it got to Haskell in 1918, because that was a very unusual outbreak. Haskell does remain, it's still a possibility. The evidence for China is primarily epidemiological. It's that China did not seem particularly hard hit by the 1918 pandemic, which suggests that people there had been exposed to the virus earlier and they had developed some natural immunity. We will probably never know where it actually did begin.
We'll probably never know. John Barry here is echoing Dr. Jordan's words from 1929. So why does this bother us so much to not know with certainty the origins of the flu pandemic, especially in the middle of another pandemic? I mean, obviously it's important in terms of medical research, and also it's just a good historical mystery to try to solve. But I think there's something deeper going on here. So I asked John Barry a final question about whether he thinks identifying the origin of the flu pandemic matters.
In a way, it doesn't matter. In another way, it matters a lot. What is the primary infectious disease threat to humans is going to be an animal virus that jumps species to humans. Influenza is one that has killed an untold number of people throughout history. When Tom Frieden, the former director of CDC, left, he was asked what kept him up at night, what were his nightmares about, and he said it's influenza, it's always the worst case scenario. The reason it doesn't matter is because it could happen. It's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. What we're going through right now obviously is not influenza, although it's remarkably similar to the 1918 virus in every way except lethality. But to know that it could happen anywhere, that's important. It's not unique to China or unique to Africa. It could happen in North America. It could happen in rural Kansas. But because it could happen anywhere, as long as we recognize that it doesn't really matter, because we have to be prepared regardless.
It could happen in rural Kansas. I think that's really the point for me. What would it mean to call it the Kansas flu instead of the Spanish flu? So when I interviewed historian Nancy Bristow, we discussed this issue of why care about the origins of a pandemic. If you remember, I interviewed Nancy for a previous episode. You should check that episode out, by the way, if you haven't already. Nancy has some great insights on the flu pandemic. Anyway, so I asked Nancy what it means culturally and politically to name the origin of a pandemic. Are we just looking for someone to blame?
Well, I think that's a really good point, because one thing that we've seen with COVID, right, is the problem of wanting to lay blame. And if you can blame someone that in the United States is too often considered, quote, the other, then you're confirming stereotypes and feeding xenophobia. So it's very problematic, it seems to me, to name it for the place that we think it might have had its origins. And here, the Spanish flu is a perfect example, because we absolutely know it did not have its origins in Spain. And here we have, for 100 years, continued to call this illness for a place that had nothing to do with its origins. So it's not only risky to use the place name because we don't know for sure, but it's also problematic because what is the point? There is no blame to be laid. The fact is, a virus emerged, and it was a very difficult virus, and it killed a lot of people. That's tragic, but there's no need to confirm stereotypes or react with xenophobic responses because a virus may have had its origins in a particular nation.
There's a feeling of powerlessness in the face of something like a pandemic, like influenza in 1918, like COVID in 2020. And laying blame makes us feel better because it gives us a feeling that we're in control in a world that can oftentimes feel so out of control, even before a pandemic occurs. So placing blame can act as a convenient distraction, a place to focus our anger when we should be really focusing on coming together to address the crisis. Because at the end of the day, it's a virus. It has no intention or emotions or rational thought. But that's really hard for humans to accept in 1918 and in 2020. Okay, enough deep thoughts for now. Next episode, we'll journey to another Haskell in Kansas, not Haskell County, but what was known at the time as the Haskell Institute outside of Lawrence, on the other side of the state. We'll hear the stories of Native American students and parents who were fighting a pandemic and discrimination at the same time. Also, what if an important piece of evidence about the Haskell, Kansas spring wave was not referring to Haskell County, but rather to the Haskell Institute? Thanks for listening to Pandemic on the Prairie. If you want to go further on this episode's topic and take a look at some of our sources, check out our website at www.flu1918ks.com. See you next time.
It was in 1919. Yes,